I'm very happy and honored to open the fourth joint symposium with Rutgers. My name is Dayan. I'm the Vice President for Research and Development at Tel Aviv University. Today's joint symposium title is Ancient and Modern Identities in Yemen. And I want to thank you all for being here. Just a quick reminder to submit questions in Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and the symposium will be recorded and shared. Our first speaker is Professor Rabi. Professor Rabi is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies and a senior researcher at the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Formerly, he was the head of the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University. From 2004 to 5, he held a visiting professorship at the Lipinski Institute of San Diego State University. His research focuses on the modern history and evolution of states and societies in the Middle East, Iranian-Arab relationship, oil and politics in the Middle East. And it's actually quite fascinating because I'm sure we will have an enjoyable symposium today. Our second speaker will be Gary Rensberg, and he will be presented by Vince in about 25 minutes. So Uzi, thank you for being with us. We're looking forward to an exciting presentation.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for this invitation. And I am very, very pleased actually to be here part of this symposium. And I hope that we're going to have a very, very effective and eye-opening discussion. What we are going actually to have here is kind of a short presentation of 20 minutes about what we call failed states in the Middle East. And the state under review, Yemen, is definitely a case to the point. So we are going actually to use Yemen as kind of an example to what we basically have in the Middle East since the Arab Spring. Look at this title. Yemen used to be in the past, in ancient times, what was depicted as the Arabia Felix, which is happy Arabia, situated at the juncture between many continents, all these trade routes of frankincense and other products that were to turn Yemen into kind of very prosperous country. Well, this was something that, as I said before, turned Yemen into kind of a spot where civilizations were prospering, including actually the Jewish community in Yemen, which might be the oldest diaspora of Jews all over the world. I am not an expert on ancient times, of course, and I can talk about Yemen nowadays or in the recent decades. And the situation in Yemen is just the mere opposite of what Yemen used to be or had been in the past. Many would depict Yemen nowadays as the unhappy Arabia. Why? Because Yemen actually was to experience the Arab Spring, as was the case in other Arab states, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and others. But in the Yemenite case, things actually were, I would say, were developing or developed in kind of a way that was very, very hazardous and very, very difficult for a state like Yemen actually to take or to stand with. Let's start with the regular geopolitical map. Here is Yemen. Yemen is situated at the corner of the Arabian Peninsula. look at the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden or the Arabian Sea, the strait here, Bab el-Mandab, nearby the city of Aden, are very, very crucial when it comes to regional geopolitics. And this was to add kind of an added value to Yemen's situation or Yemen position as a geopolitical site. Of course, while looking at that, actually we have to regard or remember that Yemen actually is having kind of an almost border on the other side with what we call the Horn of Africa. So try to think of these states, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somali. Most of them actually are states with a lot of problems, especially in the recent decades. And this whole neighborhood, so to speak, was to become kind of a very volatile and an arena of crisis, so to speak. But let's just focus in Yemen and try to assess actually what we said before, what happened in Yemen. In the beginning, basically people were to, I would say, situated in Sana'a, the capital city, trying actually to find out whether toppling the dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the then president, would create kind of a situation of a different Yemen, a Yemen that is becoming sort of a more, I would say, stable state, new relationship between rulers and ruled, and you know, all these dreams that were here in the Middle East at the beginning or the outset of the Arab Spring. The thing is that while looking at Yemen, one should understand or bear in mind that this state actually has kind of a history of what I would call tribal, sectarian affinities, and in times of crisis, these tensions were to be renewed, and this is exactly what happened in Yemen in the recent 2 decades, especially 10 years ago in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Let's just see actually from the beginning what we are talking about. Until 1990, Yemen was 2 states. One was North Yemen, the Yemen Arab Republic, states like Egypt and others who committed or carried out coup d'etats by military officers, deposing the then king. In Yemen it was the Imam, and Yemen from 1962 was to become, North Yemen, was to become a Yemen Arab Republic, which is following the footsteps of, I would say, leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who came up with this whole vision of Pan-Arabism. The other Yemen, South Yemen, or the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, was to become an independent state in 1967, when the British were to be pulled out from this region. And from then on until 1990, this state, the south of Yemen, was basically a state which bought or became under the patronage of what we call USSR, a sort of Havana, Cuba, I would say the only Marxist-Leninist state in the Middle East or in the Middle Eastern plethora. That was the schism between North and South. North was more Arab in its sense of Arab nationalism, The South, as I said before, was basically different, tilting towards what I would call actually Marxism or Leninism, but with here a very, very discerned a bunch of intellectuals, Yemenite intellectuals, who came up with some new vision for Yemen. This didn't actually happen. After the downfall of the USSR, the South Yemen actually and North Yemen decided to be united, and from then on we got just one Yemen. Look at the problems actually we got in Yemen. I don't have time to deal with that, but it is a state which is very poor, maybe the poorest state in the Middle East nowadays, or one of the poorest states in the Middle East. All these diagrams and tables could tell a story of poverty, of kind of a state which is getting closer to the incapacity actually to run or conduct a healthy economy. Of course, look at Yemen, which is here at the southern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. And when it comes to what happened or was to happen in Yemen in the end of the day, this is exactly what we got. Tribal sections, confederacies, after the downfall of the leader in Sana'a, were trying to capitalize on the situation and improve their position. Now in Yemen, history is composed of thousands of years of tribal feuds and disputes. Of course, there were chapters of harmony, but again, when you don't have kind of a well stated ruler, this is kind of an opening shot for what I would call everybody for itself. With the downfall of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, at the height of the Arab Spring, when dictator was deposed, when everybody was thinking that this was the worst and from then on we're gonna get it better, maybe kind of a slight democracy, maybe kind of a gradual change actually towards something which is much better than a cruel dictatorship. Well, at this stage, what we had seen, and similar to states like Yemen, Syria, and Libya, the state is being dismembered to its pre-state organs. So now you have to be very familiar with the history to understand who is who, and that is compatible with what I would call historic constructions. It's not just North and South, which is something which is very, very deep there, but different confederacies, maybe 300 to 400 different confederacies. Each of them has its own militia. And as I said before, and you try to imagine that, everybody is trying actually to foster kind of a future in the would-be chaos in Yemen. What we have seen here is the renewed tension of the old disputes of Muslim communities. Sunnah versus Shia. The thing was that Yemenite Shiites were very moderate. They didn't have actually all these things and slogans that we do here in nowadays Iran, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But this is the cruel destiny of a state which is being dismembered, as I said, to its pre-organs or pre-state organs. So it didn't took too much time before Shiites and Sunnis in Yemen were to become proxies at the service of two protagonists of two, I would say, enemies or erstwhile enemies in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, just above Yemen, that was to support some tribes, the regime in Sana'a, and Sunnis in particular. And in the green part, you could see that here in the mountains of Sana'a and Sa'da, all these one-time Zaydis, Shiites, Yemenites, were to acquire Iranian patronage. What we got here is a proxy war. And the state is being torn up to pieces because the regime is not able to exert full influence over the whole country. State is becoming, as I said before, dismembered. And it's not only north versus south, two different orientation, as I said before. It's not only tribal divisions, which is kind of a pattern in Yemenite history. It is now also Sunnis versus Shiites, in a conflict which is being shaped by the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. So the state is getting closer into sort of a vertigo, loses its own vitality, while everybody is trying to swallow up or to have kind of a latifundia or a lacuna, a Yemenite lacuna for himself. This is not a state by its own. The unprofessional eye will talk about Yemen. Why? Because the boundaries are still there, or the borders are still there. They might have ambassadors everywhere, and you're going to have a seat in the UN for Yemen, but in practice, de facto, this is a failed state. Even the Arab sociology or political science is very, very well familiar with this term, failed state or failing state. In Arabic, it is dawla fashila. And, you know, this become kind of one of the stories, sad stories of the Middle East in the last decade. I would say that the Jews, or the story of the Yemenite Jewry, could serve as a point here, because as I said before, you know, Yemen in ancient times was to become something which was very, very, I would say, this was, you know, maybe the oldest Jewish diaspora or community. Well, some would say that Baghdad or Babylon was the oldest, but never mind. I mean, nobody would argue against the theme that the Jews of Yemen were part and parcel of what I would call the roots of the Jewish civilization. Well, these Jews actually were so comfortable in Yemen, and I guess that you're going to hear a lot about that in the next presentation. But let me tell you that, as was the case with other Arab states in 1948, Jews were forced to leave Yemen. Most of them left in 49 or the 1950, but there were several thousands actually which were to stay in Yemen. But they, in the recent years, when Iran came in, and just one word about Iran, look at that. Iran is in many Arab states. This is the crescent that Iran actually created in states like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And now when they actually added Yemen, you can understand why Saudi Arabia does feel as a state under siege, Iranian siege. But what happened to the Jews, the remaining Jewry in Yemen? Look at that. These are Houthis. These are Yemenite Shiites who for ages were living in harmonious atmosphere with their neighboring Jews. Well, now they came up with some slogans which were gleaned from Tehran Allahu Akbar, al-Maut li America, al-Maut li Israel. So, I mean, just death to America, death to Israel. And all these things were to make Yemenites, as generally speaking, actually go for the Jews. And the last Jews were to leave Yemen in March 2016. I happened to accept some of them in Israel, and I can tell you that, well, these people, until the last moment, were hoping that there would be kind of a change and they could stay in Yemen, because they, thousands of years, actually, they felt as they are pure Yemenites, and they had to leave. So this is the story of Yemen. It gets kind of a reflection in the Arab press too. Look at Iran and Saudi Arabia from both states, and Yemen is being torn up. Look at that. That would tell us a lot too. And of course, who controls Yemen? Well, Yemen is being controlled by several patrons. Saudi Arabia, Iran, United Arab Emirates is sending troops, but not actually now. Less than that, Qatar is having a hand trying to support Muslim Brothers and some other Sunni groups which are pretty radical there. And you could see all these colors in order to understand that we are at a real crisis when it comes to Yemen nowadays. This would be actually unhappy Arabia. Just one thing, if Iran is here, you can understand that the Bab el-Mandab Strait is becoming very, very dangerous for many states in the region, not only Saudi Arabia. It could be Egypt, it could be Israel. This is why actually these states are having a presence here in order actually to just prevent from Iran to do what it is trying to do. So this is my book on Yemen, and of course, actually, all these hopes were to be turned into kind of a chaos. This chaotic situation makes it much more difficult, actually, to see the turn of the tide in Yemen. Of course, we do hope that Yemen in the 21st century is going actually at least to bring in some memories from the past, but for the time being, this is the situation, and Yemen is becoming kind of a reflection of a failed state in the Middle East. I'll stop here, and I'll be happy actually to take your comments, questions, whatever. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we continue, I would like to ask Vince Smeraglia, who is the Executive Director, Office of Research and Economic Development at Rutgers, to present our next speaker.
Thanks very much, Dan. Before I introduce Dr. Rensberg, just a note for everyone in the audience, if you do have questions either about Dr. Rabi's presentation or Dr. Rensberg's, please do ask those questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar. You can see the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Rensberg. Dr. Rensberg is a Blanche and Irving Laurie Professor of Jewish History and holds the rank of Distinguished Professor in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers. His teaching and research focuses on all things ancient Israel, primarily language and literature, through also history and archaeology. His secondary interests include ancient Egypt, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hebrew manuscript tradition, and Jewish life in the Middle Ages. Dr. Rensberg has authored 7 books and over 190 articles. His most recent book, How the Bible is Written, pays particular attention to the use of language to create literature. In addition, he has produced 2 programs for the Great Courses program, one on the Book of Genesis and one on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Finally, I'd like to mention that Dr. Rensberg has visited all the major archaeological sites of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, and has excavated at Tel Dor and Caesarea. Dr. Rensberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vince, for that lovely introduction. And it is a true pleasure to be here at the joint Rutgers Tel Aviv University Symposium. I have spent several sabbaticals in Israel over the years and know the Tel Aviv campus quite well. So it's a pleasure to share the podium, as it were, with Uzi Rabi. And let's proceed now to ancient Yemen. The history of Judaism, of course, is broad and wide and chronologically deep and geographical horizons reaching in all directions. One of the least known elements of Jewish history is what we will talk about today. How many of you knew there was a Jewish kingdom in Yemen called the Kingdom of Himyar back in the first few centuries CE? Here's our map of Yemen from that time period. Uzi already talked about the historical depth of the Yemenite Jewish community. There were certainly Jews in Yemen by at least the 3rd century CE. And we're going to be focusing on the city of Safar, which is the capital of the ancient kingdom of Himyar. You also see Sana'a, the capital of modern Yemen, on the map, and Aden, the main port city on the Gulf of Aden. And across the Red Sea, in the green, is the kingdom of Aksum. This was a Christian kingdom in Ethiopia, what is today between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And this had become a Christian kingdom pretty early on. Christianity spread from its origins in the land of Israel into Egypt, up the Nile River into Ethiopia. And this is how you get a Christian community there. There were Jews in Yemen already, as I said, by the 3rd, 4th century. And for reasons that are still unknown, for sure, the kingdom of Himyar became Jewish. The royal family converted to Judaism. And with that, probably a large percent of the population, circa 380 CE. One of the theories is, well, since there was now an Ethiopian Christian community across the Red Sea, and those are very, as Uzi said, these are closely tied political and economic entities, but also rivals for the Red Sea trade, which of course leads out to the entire Indian Ocean. And therefore, it's very possible that the royal family in Himyar said, okay, if the Christians across the water are going to be, if the Ethiopians across the water are going to become Christians, will become Jewish. And that may be, in fact, how the kingdom of Himyar became a Jewish kingdom. Now, what is the economy of this region? As Uzi already mentioned, this was a thriving economy. You may think of it as the end of the world, the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, but it was actually a place that had a thriving economy, especially because of the two products you see here, the myrrh and the frankincense, these sweet woods, which were the leading products of the region. They grow only there in the world, and they were exported by the people of southern Arabia from hoary antiquity. I'm talking about into the BCE period, at least 1000 BCE, if not earlier, either by caravans, camel caravans overland, or ships on the Red Sea to places like the port of Eilat/Aqaba in the south of Israel and Jordan, then overland to places like Gaza, and then throughout the Mediterranean. All of the temples of the ancient world, Babylonians, Egyptians, Canaanites, Hittites, Greeks, and Romans as well, all required myrrh and frankincense for their incense altars. And so this was the wealth. I have never been to Yemen. We've just heard how what a sad situation exists there. And of course, our heart goes out to the people there who continue to suffer in this humanitarian disaster. So the images I will show you are not my own, but of course, but are taken from colleagues who have visited there in more peaceful times, certainly not in the last decade. This is an overview of the excavations at Safar. And at that place, one finds a number of inscriptions which refer to Jewish life in the region. Now, a word about language. The language of Southern Arabia in those years was a language we call South Arabian. It is a Semitic language. It is more closely related to the languages of Ethiopia than it is to Arabic. So don't think of it as Arabic. Today, Yemen is a 100% Arabic-speaking country, along with something called modern South Arabian in the far eastern portions of modern-day Yemen and the far western portions of Oman. But in ancient times, you have this South Arabian language. We call it Epigraphic South Arabian or Ancient South Arabian. And this is what it looks like. It has its own alphabet. And what I've done here is transcribe the letters of that alphabet into Hebrew characters. For those of you who can read the Hebrew, it's a one-to-one correspondence. A yod is a yod, a hey is a hey, etc. And here is a very large monumental inscription in the Sabaic dialect. There were 4 main dialects of South Arabian, of which Sabaic is by far the best attested of them. And it mentions a man named Judah, Yehuda. It refers to his people of Israel, Sa'abhu Yisrael. And then the synagogue, using the South Arabian word mikrab. This is a remarkable inscription. And I've highlighted there in the boxes. Now, in the middle, you will, by the way, on the right, middle, and left, you will notice these large, what are called monograms. More of this inscription, by the way, right here, right. It refers to God as the Lord of life and death, Lord of heaven and earth. You get a sense of the monotheistic approach here. Everybody else in South Arabia would have been worshiping old Arabian polytheistic deities. Shall we try to read a little bit of this in the South Arabian language? It would have sounded something like Mara Hayin wa Motan Mara Shamayin wa Ardan, something like that. And in the middle of that, here's the monogram that you see in the middle. And now we zoom into it. There is a Hebrew graffito in the middle, right here. So while the whole inscription that you see around the edges, we just zoomed into the middle here, is in this South Arabian alphabet, these are South Arabian letters, somebody later on wrote in Hebrew right here, and it says, if you can read Hebrew, you can read this, although I put it in the text box there for you on the left. Katav Yehuda Zachor Latov, Amen, Amen, Shalom. Or the other way, Amen, Shalom, Amen. Judah wrote this, may he be remembered for good, Amen, Shalom, Amen. This is remarkable. So the Jews of Yemen, at a distance of 2,600 kilometers or so from the land of Israel, have retained their knowledge of Hebrew to the extent that somebody can inscribe or incise into the stone here this Hebrew inscription. Another Sabaic inscription mentioning, again, their people of Israel, Sa'ab Hamu Yisrael, something like that is probably how to pronounce this, from Safar. And again, referring to God as El, or God, Lord of heaven and earth. These are all common expressions in Judaism and in biblical texts and post-biblical texts, and we find them here in these inscriptions. Another inscription, not from Safar, but from around the middle of the 5th century, again, Lord of heaven, God of Israel. I should mention that stone inscriptions, for those of you who don't know the way archaeology works, are notoriously difficult to date. Carbon-14 tests can be done only on organic material, something that was once alive, animal bones, wood, textiles, anything such as that. When you're looking at stone, they're very difficult to date. So we rely mainly on the paleography, that is to say the handwriting, and the specialists, paleographers and epigraphists, are able to date these more or less on the basis of the way the script might have changed with ever so slight changes during the centuries. We have a synagogue dedication inscription from Yemen. Unfortunately, not a good image here for you. It actually has a date so that we can date it, place named Raida, 70 kilometers north of present-day Sana'a. And here's the translation of this inscription. So the synagogue, the mikrab, meaning the place of worship or the synagogue, has a name, by the way, Barik, blessed place. So synagogues, for example, still have names. This place is called Barik, the blessed place, but it's the synagogue Barik for El, that is the God, Lord of the sky and earth, etc., and a whole bunch of names. And then you see here in the second paragraph, right, that the prayer is that God should grant these people peace and so on. And there is a precise date which allows us to equate that date to 433 CE. And then it says at the end, although in the Sabaic writing, Shalom, Shalom. We also have a cemetery dedicatory inscription, by the way, which I don't have a photo of, but it tells us that the Jews had their own cemetery. And in fact, that cemetery inscription states that this is a cemetery for the Jews and that Gentiles should not be buried here alongside Jews, which would be in accordance with Jewish law. So that's Sabaic material. Now, Jews, of course, their ancestral language is Hebrew, but during this time period, we're using more and more Aramaic as well. And this is a seal. The thing on the left is actually quite small. I've blown them up here for you. A seal was used to stamp things, right? So you could stamp a piece of clay with your seal to show that you were the ownership of whatever the clay was attached to. And it actually says here only the person's name, also from Safar. And it says Yitzchak bar Hanina, two good Hebrew names using the Aramaic word bar, son of. Keep in mind, by the way, that these seals are always created by the stonecutter with reverse imagery. So here I've blown up the letters, which you would have a difficult time reading, and even if you could read the Hebrew Aramaic material, because they're in mirror image, so that when you do stamp it, it will appear correctly on the clay that has been stamped. But of course, with Photoshop, we can change anything around nowadays. So here you can all read it. If you can read Hebrew, you see Yitzchak bar Hanina right here with some Jewish iconography, probably indicating the ark that would have been inside synagogues. A bilingual Aramaic Hebrew Sabaic, trilingual Aramaic/Hebrew Sabaic tomb inscription. Its exact provenance is unknown. It's now in a private collection. All of this is to show you that there are Jews in Yemen throughout this period that we're talking about, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Let's read a little bit of the Aramaic, and then it segues into Hebrew there at the top. It's always nice to hear this aloud. You can read the Hebrew with me, fine. If not, I will translate it regardless. Hada kivurata, this is the burial place. De Leah brat Yehuda, of Leah, the daughter of Judah. And then it segues into Hebrew. Nishmatah lechaye olam, v'tanuach v'ta'amod l'goral chayim l'ketz hayamin, amen v'amen shalom. Okay? May her soul be for eternal life, and may she rest, and may she rise up at the fated end of days, with the fate of life at the end of days. Amen, amen, shalom. Right? These are Jewish religious beliefs being expressed, and then the South Arabian material basically says the same thing for you. Now, let me introduce you to a Christian scholar of the time, a man named Philostorgius, and those are his dates, bridging the 4th and 5th century. Philostorgius, a church father, wrote the ecclesiastical history, that is to say, the history of the church down to his day, 1st third of the 5th century CE. And in this work, he reports that about 100 years earlier, 2 or 3 generations earlier, a Christian missionary named Theophilus went to Yemen, and that he found there many Jews living in circa 350. So we don't have Theophilus's work, but Theophilus's report is embedded into Philostorgius's ecclesiastical history, and this would be right around the time when the kingdom of Himyar was becoming Jewish. Let me repeat that, right? The kingdom of Himyar, which previously was not Jewish, must have been exposed to a significant number of Jews and Judaism through them to begin to become Jewish themselves in the last quarter of the 4th century. So how do we know all this, and where does all this information come from? Gary Rensberg, I did not do the basic research here. So I just want to applaud my colleague Christian Robin in Paris. He is the leading historian of ancient South Arabia. And he has worked assiduously over the course of his career, trip after trip to Yemen, and some of the South Arabian material spills over into southern Saudi Arabia. And he visits these places, not recently, but visits these places year after year and tracks down these inscriptions that are carved into stone, in slabs, in the rock, and so on. And he has created the entire history of Southern Arabia that we know today. Robin did not go looking for Jews. Let me make that clear. He's not a historian of Judaism or Jewish history. He is a historian of the Arabian Peninsula, especially South Arabia, and is an expert in the Sabaic inscriptions and the other dialects of ancient South Arabian as well. But as his work proceeded through, starting in the 1970s, in the 80s and the 90s, he began to realize there is much more Jewish material here than we ever knew. We had inklings of a Jewish kingdom at Himyar from occasional reports. We had knowledge of Jewish community there, although very little detail about it, such as the example I just shown you from Christian writers. But it was Robin who put it all together with these two very long articles published in 2003 and 2004. And it is from that that I have now incorporated this into my own teaching of Jewish history. Really phenomenal work by a wonderful colleague, Professor Robin. Here's a Hebrew inscription. So it's one thing to see South Arabian inscriptions, which the Jews, of course, were using as their native language in Yemen. Some bilinguals, fine, but there's even an entire Hebrew inscription from this place, Beit Hadder, 15 kilometers east of Sana. The whole thing is in Hebrew. We don't have the whole inscription. And what is it? Remarkably, it is a list of the 24 mishmarot. Now, what are mishmarot? This is a Hebrew term which means something like rotations. So we know from the latter books of the Bible and from post-biblical Jewish texts that there were 24 priestly families which served in the temple in Jerusalem on 2-week rotations. You may say, why doesn't that only is 48 weeks of the year? Why not even it out so that they would have the number of rotations 2 weeks for the whole year? And the answer to that is the 24 Mishmarot allows for a rotation, so the same family isn't always doing, for example, Passover, or the same family isn't always doing Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, so that over the course of a few decades, the family would rotate through and everybody would have an opportunity to be the priest serving in the temple at a particular festival. And we have these lists from the Book of Chronicles and from elsewhere. Book of Chronicles, one of the last books of the Bible, and elsewhere. Now, by the time this was written, let's say 4th century or 5th century, the temple's been destroyed for hundreds of years. But the Jews kept track of this. Now, the fact that they kept track of this in the land of Israel is no surprise. They had a continuity within the land of Israel from the destruction of the temple to the communities that are still there. One of the places we have such an inscription from, by the way, is Caesarea, where I excavated, as Vince said when he introduced me. That inscription was found long before my days at Caesarea, on the coast of Israel. I'll show you in a moment the map. But the fact that the Jews of Yemen, in far-off Himyar, in the kingdom there, kept track of this is also remarkable. And 9 of these names, we don't have the full inscription here, but 9 of these names appear also in 1 Chronicles chapter 24. So this is a remarkable piece of Jewish continuity across time and space. Again, there is the kingdom of Himyar, another map, just to give us a sense of its location and some of the places that I have been, to which I have been referring. Now, let me end by taking you to the place in northern Israel known as Beit Sha'arim, and before Makota, that is. You see Caesarea there on the map now on the coast between modern-day Haifa and Tel Aviv. Beit Sha'arim in the lower Galilee is the largest necropolis of Jewish tombs from, let's say, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, maybe 6th centuries. It's a mountainside, and there are dozens of catacombs carved into the mountainside. This is the main one, the most prominent one. Many of you may have been there. Especially the Israelis will know this place. And if you go into these catacombs, you see artwork on the walls, sarcophagi, niches. Does everybody see the niches here where you would lay the deceased along with these large sarcophagi? Some of these sarcophagi are just remarkably well decorated, as this one here. It's an incredible site that is well worth visiting. If you've been to Israel, you may have been there. If not, make sure you stop at Beit Sha'arim one day. More niches there on the left, catacomb after catacomb after catacomb. And one of them, unfortunately now closed to the public, but hopefully on my next trip to Israel, I'll get there and get some good color photographs. So all we have are these black and white ones. One of the catacombs, number 7, there is an arch, which I'll show you in just a second. You see the beginning of it here. And it is a section of the burial site for the Himyarites. Here's that arch, very hard to read. And it actually says in Greek there, we photo enhance it. It says in Greek there that this is of the Himyarites, omeriton in Greek. That tells us that of these catacombs at Beit Sharim, and the text box there in the upper left, the red box there in the upper left gives you the approximate location of Beit Sharim. 2,600 kilometers from the kingdom of Himyar to Beit Sharim, the Jews of this region, living at the far margins of the Jewish diaspora life. There were Jews in Iberia by this point to the far west, but this is basically as far away as you can get from the land of Israel. There were Jews in Cologne already by this point in the Rhineland, but this is pretty isolated as you can imagine, at basically the end of the earth. However, the Jews kept track of their love and devotion to the land of Israel, and those who could afford it arranged for their burials. How this happened, camel caravans up the west coast of Arabia, the Hijaz, by sea to the port of Eilat and then overland, we don't know, but it's an indication of how the Jews of Yemen in this ancient period, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, continued to be attached to the land of Israel. In the last few minutes, let me provide for you a coda to bring it up to the very present and to tie it into current work being done at Rutgers University. In the early 1960s, a collection of Hebrew manuscripts was donated by the Robeson family of northern New Jersey to Rutgers University. A preliminary catalog was created in 1964 by Leon Feldman, Rutgers professor. Now, both these gentlemen are now deceased, and Morris Lutsky, a bibliographer at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. These 50 manuscripts are written by Yemenite Jewish scribes from about 1600 to 1900. So they're not in any way connected to the ancient kingdom of Himyar. I'm just bringing this up to date because this is what's going on at Rutgers right now. And they're housed in Alexander Library. I should point out, if you think about the matter, you'll know that printing was invented in the 15th century by Gutenberg in Europe, in Germany in particular. Printing spread to Italy, to Constantinople. There were printing presses throughout the Mediterranean, throughout Europe, in 1600, 1700, 1800, and so on. It's not clear if there was a printing press in Hebrew in Yemen. There may not even have been many printing presses for Arabic in Yemen in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Into the 20th century, Yemenite Jews continued to write Jewish texts by hand, hence manuscripts, something written by hand, because they didn't have a printing press. And this is a remarkable testimony to that Yemenite Jewish community. Here is our Alexander Library, and in our rare books and special collections, we have these remarkable manuscripts. Here's an 18th century manuscript of Leviticus through Deuteronomy. And the Yemenite Jewish community, I quickly point out, is the one Jewish community in the world, along with some Iraqi Jews, which kept track not only of the Hebrew original, but also the Aramaic translation and the Arabic translation of the Torah. So that when you have a verse in Hebrew, which you have here, it ends here. You then have the Aramaic written out, which ends here. And you then have the Arabic written out, but in Hebrew characters, what we call Judeo-Arabic. And this is a translation, by the way, produced by the great Jewish scholar Saadia Gaon, who lived in the 10th century, more than a millennium ago. And the Yemenite Jews have kept track of this. And we have this beautiful collection of recently produced manuscripts. These are not like the great treasures of the Middle Ages before the age of printing, but they're a testimony to Jewish scribal practices among Yemenite Jews. And we are the custodians of this at Rutgers University. We created a digital record of this. We hired a professional photographer, and you were looking at his images right now. Here is a Passover Haggadah written by a Yemenite scribe of, undetermined date, but let's say sometime in the 18th century. Again, if you can read Hebrew, you see the Manishtana begins right here. Manishtana halayla hazeh, mikol halelot. Why is this night different from all other nights? And then down here, it has the Judeo-Arabic version of it. Again, it shifts into Arabic, although in Hebrew characters. Uzi, I'm sure you're loving all this, being fluent in both Hebrew and Arabic. And one more example, not the Hebrew at all, only the Arabic translation of the Book of Esther, what's known in Jewish tradition as tafsir, the Arabic translation of any biblical book, in this case, the Book of Esther. So a remarkable collection. I bring my students there, as you can see here, and the entire digital record is now going to be integrated into the National Library of Israel. They have a project called Ketiv, the International Collection of Digitized Hebrew Manuscripts. So the National Library of Israel, which sits on the campus of the Hebrew University, although a new building is being built for the expanded library in Jerusalem, abutting the Hebrew University campus. But our colleagues at Tel Aviv are all involved with this work as well, given the fact that this is a worldwide effort being head up by the National Library of Israel. And we at Rutgers now play our small part in that enterprise. We end with the two languages in which I can say thank you, toda, shukran.
Thanks very much, Dr. Rensberg. Thank you for bringing the ancient history of Yemen so vividly alive. I want to remind colleagues in the audience, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom to ask all your questions. And now I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Jose Roman, who is the Vice President of Research Administration at Rutgers University, to moderate the Q&A. Jose, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so very much. Good day to all our viewers. And thank you so very much to our two scholars for really thought-provoking presentations. My first question is to Dr. Rendsburg. How is the history that you've just shared with us still alive in modern Yemen or affecting modern Yemen? Or has that history simply disappeared?
Well, that is probably a better question for Uzi. I will just say that the Yemenite Jews, the majority of whom came to Israel circa 1950, and the ones who have just recently in the last few years left Yemen for Israel, are exceedingly proud of their past. As far as I know, Uzi helped me, as far as I know, they were not aware of the Jewish kingdom of Himyar. We really had almost no knowledge of it. It was not handed down amongst the Jews of Yemen. The Jews of Yemen just knew that they were the Jews who were the descendants of Jews who arrived there, let's say, almost 2,000 years ago. I did not mention, by the way, that the origins of that Jewish community, so I should actually just say that, the origins of that Jewish community were the great Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire in the year 66 CE through 70, and then a second revolt in 132 to 135, known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. Jews left after that. Many Jews left the Roman Empire, and they went to Arabia, North Arabia as well, by the way. Sites that are in northern Saudi Arabia today, such as Tema, and all the way down to the southern Arabian Peninsula, as we saw, where the Jews have lived. As far as I know, the Jews of Yemen did not know about the ancient kingdom of Himyar. It was recovered by modern scholars. Uzi, comment?
Yep. I think that, as far as I know, I mean, and I have some friends actually from that community here in Israel at all levels and ages. Most of them, almost all of them, are not familiar with Himyar, actually, but they are very proud of their Yemenite identity. And it's very interesting, Gary, actually, just to kind of a follow up on what you just, in your very, very eye-opening presentation. Even me, when I'm fluent in Arabic, I find it very difficult actually to follow the Arabic being spoken by Yemenite Jews, because it is a sort of a composition of Aramite, Hebrew, and Arabic. And this is different, by the way, from the Arabic spoken by let's say Arab Yemenites, actually the locals. And this is typical to every Arab state, but when it comes to the Yemenite Jews, it is a very, very proud community. And I am pretty sure that, once you are looking at their daily life, many, many things that do relate to one-time Yemen are still there, albeit in kind of a modern shape.
My next question is for Dr. Rabi. I was recently reading a European newspaper and reading about what's happening in Yemen, and it was sort of an interesting story because it kind of played out what was happening there is Sunnis versus Shia. That was really essentially kind of the story that I was reading, and I'm wondering, given what you've just presented, to what extent is religion truly at the core of some of these struggles, or is religion basically a mask for historic political and economic forces? What is the place of religion in the struggle that's happening right now in Yemen?
Well, I think, Jose, that you are right. Actually, I tend to think that religion is being used as kind of a means for geopolitical motivations. In my opinion, it's all over the Middle East, but in Yemen, it gets kind of a reflection by this proxy war. But just, I would like actually to sharpen up this point, Jose. In Yemen, in my opinion, the conflict is multi-layered, because you have the tribes, you have the regions, you have also the later on phenomenon of Sunni and Shia. And this by itself actually makes this the situation a little bit chaotic. But I do think that, this is part and parcel of the fate of what I would call failed states. It is not a mere coincidence that while looking at Iraq or Syria or Libya, you would see the same scenario, albeit in differences, but the same scenario. On the other hand, while looking at Egypt or Tunisia or some other states that haven't got all these differences when it comes to the composition of the population, well, I mean, one should see and say that there the situation is, relatively speaking, much more stable. And basically, if to take Tunisia, there is kind of a very, very, I would say, fascinating attempt at build up sort of how I would say Western style actually government system, sort of a democracy. We'll have to wait and see, but it has to do with what I call all these, what the composition is. And this is very important when it comes to states like Yemen.
Let's go to a question posed by one of our viewers, and it asks, what is the most ancient epigraphic evidence of Jewish presence in South Arabia?
Well, as I said, the stone inscriptions are exceedingly difficult to date unless they have a date on them, like our synagogue dedication inscription. But I would say probably 4th century. If the kingdom of Himyar becomes Jewish in, let's say, circa 380, that would be essentially the earliest epigraphic material. On the other hand, as I mentioned, we have a report of a Christian visitor to Yemen slightly earlier than that, circa 350 CE. So that's already, if you count that as our earliest, that would be our earliest. I don't remember, I'd have to go back and look. I don't, off the top of my head, know if earlier Jewish sources from the land of Israel actually refer to Jews in Yemen at the, let's say, 2nd or 3rd century. I don't think we have them, okay? But certainly by the 4th century, we have good evidence for them.
Another one of our viewers asks, do you know when and why the Jewish kingdom of Himyar ceased to exist as a political entity?
Yes, and actually, let me also just go back and say the following, this was devoted to southern Arabia, but if you go to northern Arabia, I mentioned the oasis of Tema in northern Saudi Arabia. We have evidence for Jews there in circa 200 CE. So that we actually, but of course it's closer to the land of Israel. It's northern Arabia, not southern Arabia. The kingdom of Himyar was defeated by the Christian kingdom of Aksum sometime in the 6th century. And it seems to have been brought an end to that kingdom. And let's also, of course, remember that soon after that, in the first third of the 7th century, you have the life of Muhammad and the rise of Islam, when the entire peninsula becomes Muslim, with very small Christian minorities dotting the peninsula and a sizable Jewish minority continuing to exist in Yemen. But the geopolitical entity will all become part of the caliphate of the early Muslim caliphates, especially the first major one, the Umayyads.
Another viewer asks, this viewer was wondering, what is new with regards to DNA research and Yemeni Jews?
I don't know. I'll say one thing, and then maybe Uzi has more. I do know that in the Worldwide DNA Project, and I think Stanford University is one of the places where much of this research has taken place. It has been shown that the Jews anywhere in the world, regardless of their host countries, Yemen, Morocco, Russia, Germany, Italy, you name it, have closer DNA to each other than they do to the hosts. That is to say, the majority Yemenites, the majority Moroccans, and so on. Which of course demonstrates that these are all individuals descended of the ancient Jewish people from the land of Israel, and that DNA itself is what we would call a Levantine DNA. But I don't know if anything more specifically has been done with the Jews of Yemen. Uzi, do you have any idea?
No, I am familiar with those research that you just mentioned, actually, when it comes to their affinity to the land of Israel. But I am not familiar with any specific research regarding Yemenite Jews.
Yeah.
Nope.
Well, folks, this is going to be our last question. And it's a question posed to Dr. Rabi. You've had the opportunity to do a significant amount of study and research and thinking around failed states. As you reflect on this, what would be some of your thoughts about how modern humanity can manage these ancient identities and ancient feuds, these, to use your phrase, historic constructions that are so deeply affecting not only Yemen, but a significant number of other countries around the world?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of statesmen or politicians. I would say that it has to do with education. You know, I mean, in my opinion, actually, what we have to do in order to heal the wounds of the Middle East is just to make sure that I am familiar with the otherness of the other. And this should be achieved only by kind of an educational revolution. All these, ancient identities are having kind of reflection or kind of a movement here and there, but basically they are capitalizing at times of crisis. And this is kind of an result of a predicament, ongoing predicament. What we have to make sure in this region, the Middle East, is that the other should be respected. And the only way by which to educate people that the other should be respected is to teach them who the other is. This is why here in the Dayan Center, for example, What we are trying to do is just to understand Yemen or Iran or Turkey or Saudi Arabia or whatever by having kind of a full knowledge about the history, about the language, and to get an idea of how people could memorize themselves. Only once having that, we can better understand who is who and how to deal with our, let's say, others. Of course, that has to be vice versa too. But since it is of educational nature, I think that at least in the middle, or maybe in the long run, we're going to have something different in the Middle East, because the new digital media, social media, is of great assistance for us to come to be exposed to the other. We have many talks with other friends in the Middle East, and I do hope that in the 21st century, of course, in the medium or the long run, we're going to have something else of these exchange of views, something which is to be defined as bottom up, not top down. And I dare say that in some Arab quarters, you can see that, and this is becoming something which is very different, to start actually deal with these identities. And the more you are familiar with the other, the better, because there is kind of a chance by which to have a harmonious coexistence. You are different than me. I am different than you. It doesn't mean that I would force me on you, or the vice versa. What we have to do after having been exposed to our differences is to start thinking how we're going to work together. And I am happy to say that in some parts of the Middle East, this already had been done and goes on. In failed states, it would take some more time, but we have actually to keep hope that in the future we're going to have kind of a different course for the Middle East and for all of us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rabi. Thank you, Dr. Rensberg, for the wonderful presentations. I also want to thank Dan Pierre for hosting us, and to Jose Roman for his moderating the Q&A. I want to remind the audience that this session is recorded, so if any of your colleagues weren't able to listen today, we will supply the recording to all of you through a web link. The next session of the Rutgers TAU Joint Symposium will be on April 6th, and we'll send out some materials on the topic and the speakers. Thank you all for your time and attention today, and looking forward to the next one. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Gary.